as always, banks are the center of a lot of conversation, whether it is NPAs and their resolution through the bankruptcy process, whether promoters can buy back their own assets, or whether it is the revamp and restructuring of public sector banks. Banking is in the eye of a storm, as always, and I have with me someone who has seen the banking sector through several cycles of upturns and downturns. Dr. Rangarajan, former Governor, Reserve Bank of India. Dr. Rangarajan, thank you very much for joining me. Well, the Finance Minister has clearly said that recapitalization will come with reform. According to you, what should be the one or two things that should definitely be part of reform while recapitalizing public sector banks?
In a sense that the public sector banks have run into these problems because of the failure to conform to certain standards or prescriptions. Therefore, if you are trying to bail out or if you are trying to help the commercial banks, then this help should go hand in hand with what we consider to be the most important things that can be done to prevent such crises happening again. Therefore, one of the important things that we really need to focus on is what do we do about the organizational structure of the banks, the way in which we look at the public sector banks and how many should be there and how many should be merged with others. And then, of course, there is an overall question about how are the public sector banks managed. I think these are two sets of issues which we should address.
Okay.
One, looking at the size and the number of banks. Second, looking at the way in which the public sector banks should be managed.
But which should be first at this juncture, sir? Because we have a large number of banks where the NPA percentage is above 10%. There are only a few which are even below 10%, and even they are above 5% in terms of NPA as a percentage of total loans. At such a time, can we wait for mergers for reform, or should it be structural reform first and then mergers?
I think I would say structural reforms first.
Okay.
Because I believe that even the merging would be a difficult task,
yes,
unless we have undertaken some reforms in the which are of a fundamental nature.
Okay.
Actually, merger and acquisitions are a common feature even in a well-organized banking system.
That's true.
It happens whenever one institution feels a need to merge or one institution feels the need to acquire. Therefore, that can happen in the normal course. But in our situation, the normal course essentially means that government also taking the initiative.
Okay.
But I think structural reforms which are needed must be undertaken to first before merging, but it need not rule out mergers at all.
Okay.
If there are some institutions which feel the need and so on, let them do it. But any major reorganization of the banking system itself in terms of the number, size and all that can wait till we have resolved the NPA issue and also resolve how banks will be managed.
Okay. Well, what do you mean by structural reform first? What should be the most crucial reform?
I think the management of the banks is a critical issue. I think even though certain things were laid out earlier, saying that we will reform the banks and so on, nothing has really happened. I mean, even now one hears about delay in the appointment of chairman or the managing director. Sometimes the banks are without the head for quite a long time.
No, but even if they're appointed in time, is that reform enough? I mean,
no, that's not enough. I mean, I'm saying that the relationship between the government and the bank must be clearly spelled out. Then there are other issues which are not so fundamental, but also how much time should we give to the bank chairman as a tenure?
Okay.
I mean, is there a minimum tenure? I mean, there have been instances and cases of people having had only 1 year or even less than 1 year. It was said at one time in terms of the criteria, there will be some cutoff in terms of the age. But it was followed in 1 year or so, and then the next year it was given up. Therefore, the reform of the way in which the banks are being run is extremely important.
Okay. And tenure is one. Yeah. What would be the other? Would you say that government stake should come down just below 50, say to 49, so that they can recruit laterally? Right now, I mean, State Bank of India chairman, the former chairman, was bemoaning she couldn't even go to the universities and recruit fresh people from management schools. So if you're brought under 50, then you don't have these problems. Also, you don't have the investigative agencies, the CBEC, constantly asking for reports. Is that part of your reform plan at all?
Well, I think I will view the problem slightly differently. Yes, the facts that you presented constitute one angle to the approach of this problem. The other is somewhat related to the number of banks that the system should have. Basically, one can see that so long as the government has to have 51%, then the extent to which the capitalization of that bank can expand depends upon the ability of the fisc to contribute to that. I think, leaving aside ideology, purely from the point of view of the ability of the fisc to finance all these banks, to capitalize all these banks adequately, we should move away, first of all, from not having all the banks, keep some banks, others you let it go below 51%, and contribute whatever capital that you can do. I think that is one thing, but that's a purely pragmatic way of looking at the problem. Okay. The other is that the 51% rule does not necessarily mean that we have to do things in the way in which we are now doing. Okay. Now, the argument about the placement of people or recruitment of people is not bound by this.
It's a court order, sir. The court said that since you are part of the government, you have to recruit only through, national examinations. That
well, I think we really need to take it to a higher level of authority and say that you should give us the freedom to be able to manage our affairs. I mean, it cannot really be that everything should be followed in a particular way.
But even the investigative agencies say the same thing. Once you are 51% government, you are government. And therefore, you come under the CAG, you come under the CBC, which...
Well, I think the way CAG, CBG, the CBC and others look at the problem will also have to change. I mean, I don't think that the tail should not wag the dog. Okay. I think we really need to ensure...
That's easier said, isn't it, sir? I mean, they apply the law, and the law says that if you are 51% owned by the government, you're government.
No, that's the... I mean, I think we really need to take that issue up. I mean, really, what is government? Every institution of a particular nature should be treated as government. I think these things evolved over a period of time. I mean, let the highest authority in the country, legal authority in the country, take a view on this.
Okay. So aside from the tenure of chairman, what would be other reforms that you think are
I think we really need to look at the management by the board and so on and so forth. Is this the most satisfactory way of doing it?
Okay.
We
need independent boards, you would say.
Independent boards. And we also need how the boards function. Is there a way of improving the functioning of the banks, banks boards? Okay. People come, they are right on that day. Sometimes papers are presented only on the table. There's so many things are happening. Now, it's a purely management issue, question. Okay. And we really need to lay down all of these things, particularly when the ownership and the management are separated. Okay. We really need to do that.
Okay. So what about this ordinance that the government has brought, that promoters should not be allowed to buy back the assets of those large NPAs which are now with the bankruptcy courts? Your thoughts on that?
Well, my immediate reaction is that it doesn't appear to be a wrong thing to do. I mean, because if a set of people have been responsible for getting the institution into a bad shape, into a bad situation, to enable the same to come back and bid through the route doesn't appear to be right. But I am told, and I read elsewhere also, that in other countries this is permitted. This is not, the promoters are not barred from doing it. But we are in a difficult situation. Please remember that all the actions that we are taking are putting a strain on the fisc also. Therefore, if there is a haircut, ultimately the burden falls on the fisc. At that particular time, it looks somewhat inconsistent to see that the very fellows who were responsible for running down the institution should be brought back because of a particular rule. I tend to view that the promoters...
No, I find that very repugnant. But to come back to this, to the question where I started, therefore, if India had had only private sector banks, then the haggling of how much haircut you give a promoter is between a private borrower and a private lender. It would not have become a fiscal question because the taxpayers' money was not involved. So I'm coming back to the same question. Was the problem from the start that, you know, we have too many public sector banks? If they were all private banks, then they would have been handled very differently, probably.
No, as I mentioned, the question of the number of public sector banks is an important issue. And perhaps every decision is also historically determined. I mean, I think we cannot get away from history. So we have had the nationalization, we have had the various other actions. Therefore, the step that we should adopt now is a step towards having a very limited number of public sector banks and creating conditions under which they will operate similar to the private sector banks. But reducing the number of public sector banks which we now have.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Rangarajan. We do hope that the recapitalization will come with some seminal reforms. Thank you very much for joining us.